Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest, episode 61. This is Dan Lizette, and I thank you guys very much for tuning in again. As many of you know, longtime listeners, since I'm past a year now, I feel entitled to say longtime listeners. You guys know that one of the preeminent show styles that I constantly feature are interviews and recommendations of technology-based podcasts. I am a huge tech podcast fan, and I've featured a lot of great guests in the past. Many of you have told me how much you've enjoyed them, from Jason Snell to Mike Hurley to Stephen Hackett to Adam Christensen, Michael Fisher, and I'm continuing that streak today with this episode. I've actually been speaking with this gentleman for a very long time in terms of hoping he would join me. He was one of the first folks that I really wanted to have a chance to talk to. And he is 1/3 of the Accidental Tech Podcast and 1/2 of Relay FM's Analog with previous Podcast Digest guest Mike Hurley. I'm really honored to be joined by Mr. Casey Liss. Casey, welcome.
Hello. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. I'm doing absolutely wonderful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me. And while I know you do a lot of talking on podcasts, and folks may think they know you pretty well, hopefully we can let folks know a little bit more about Casey. So anyone who isn't familiar with you, Casey, can you tell them a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I am 1/3 of the Accidental Tech Podcast with tech powerhouses Marco Arment and John Siracusa. You might know Marco as one of the co-founders of the website Tumblr. He had another successful podcast of his own called Build and Analyze. John Siracusa is probably best known for his novel-length reviews of the Mac operating system OS X on Ars Technica, which he has not done for the first time in a decade and change, I believe, this year. And he also had a successful podcast on 5x5 called Hypercritical. And that's Accidental Tech Podcast is John, Marco, and myself. I'm kind of the other guy when it comes to that show. And then on Relay FM, as you mentioned, I am 1/2 of Analog with Mike Hurley. Analog is kind of a show about, basically feelings and how technology and feelings kind of come together. The Accidental Tech Podcast, by comparison, is your typical Apple-oriented talk show with kind of three talking heads, just analyzing the news of the day. My personal background, before podcasting, I was and am a software developer. I typically actually do my work in the Microsoft world, which is a little bit different and weird. But I have a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for Apple and their products and for mobile. And so I find that I end up talking about a lot of that during my podcasts. And outside of that, I have a growing family. We have a nearly 1-year-old son, my wife and I, which took a little while to get here, which we were very excited about. And I also am a big football fan. We were discussing before the show that you also have the appropriate choice in football teams in the New York Football Giants. And I'm very excited to hear that. 2-2
as of now. And as far as I'm concerned, that's reason to celebrate.
Especially lately. I agree.
I was telling somebody, I said, somebody who, a friend of mine on Twitter, who's also a previous guest on the Podcast Digest, actually, he is a Tampa Bay Buccaneer fan. And this past Sunday, he was ranting and raving. And I said, it's okay. I'm a New York Giants fan. I know misery.
Yeah, we know highs and we know lows, and they come eerily close together.
His comeback was, you guys have 2 rings in the last 10 years. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
I said, Eli throws more interceptions than any other quarterback, and we blow off our fingers on 4th of July. He says, okay, point taken.
It's so true. It's so ridiculous. I mean, I love the Giants. I'm a Giants fan mostly because my maternal grandfather has been a Giants fan since I can remember, probably since around the time the franchise, well, no, I guess not since the franchise started, but since probably he was old enough to know what football was. And so it just has carried through the family. And, I live in Redskins country, you live in Eagles country, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. But nevertheless, I stay strong with my Giants, and they've done us right and they've done us wrong, but it's always an adventure.
Absolutely. Well, let's go back and talk about podcasting. I don't want to ask too general a question, but how in the world did you start in on podcast, Casey?
So around the time that Marco was ending Build and Analyze, he felt like it had just gone through its run. It was probably time to retire it. This was, I'm probably going to get this chronology wrong, but I want to say it was December of 2012. I'm pretty sure that's right. I had been giving Marco a lot of crap that, hey, we should do something about cars because nobody does a show about cars, and that would be a lot of fun. We should do a show about cars. So Marco ends the show in December-ish of 2012-ish, and I'm still just unloading on Marco. I'm pretty sure I was beating him up about it. Maybe it was reverse and my memory's failing me, but we decided, maybe we should do this. And then around the same time, by pure happenstance, John Syracuse was ending Hypercritical right around December of 2012. And so Marco had the genuinely brilliant idea, why don't we ask John to do this? John's into cars. And I had known Marco since I was very young, since we were both probably 8 or 10 years old. And I'd only known John for a couple of years at this point. But John was nice enough to say, let's do a show about cars. And so the three of us started the show, this very short-lived show called Neutral. It ran for 12 episodes plus a special that we did a little bit later on. And Neutral in many ways will be like my first love. I miss Neutral. I won't say it was my favorite, but in some ways it was my favorite. It was, as we described it at the very top of the website to this day, it was a casual car show from people who should know better than to do a car show. None of the three of us have any terribly practical knowledge about cars. We have a lot of theoretical knowledge about cars. We got so much feedback during that show, despite the fact that not that many people listened to it, about how wrong we were about just about everything. But I loved that show so much, and I miss that show. And if the two of them were willing, I would do it again tomorrow. And so that's how we got started. And what ended up happening was we would talk about cars for, an hour and a half, and we would end the show and we would just hang on Skype talking to each other. And when you take three computer programmers and put them on a phone call for long enough, no matter what you're actually trying to talk about, inevitably you end up talking about what's going on in the world of computer programming and Apple and things of that nature. And Marco had the idea of, let me just put one or two of these on SoundCloud. When we started talking, I think it was actually mostly Marco and John talking about the theoretical larger sized iPhone a solid year or two, I guess 2 years before it came out or something like that. And Marco put that on SoundCloud, and you know what? Go figure. But when you take three guys that don't know anything about cars and ask them to talk about cars, I guess it's not that compelling a listen. But if you take three guys that kind of know something about technology and have them talk about technology, it turns out we actually knew some things and we were kind of interesting to listen to. And so what ended up happening was this kind of quasi show that we were releasing almost as a B-side to Neutral ended up having a lot more legs than Neutral did. And so we ended up kind of making that a thing. And there were a few weeks where we ran Neutral and the newly minted Accidental Tech podcast, which we created by accident. We ran those kind of side by side. And then when Neutral kind of ran its course and we kind of finished what ended up being a really nice story arc in Neutral, then we kept going with the Accidental Tech podcast. And that officially got kind of recognized by the three of us in around March of 2013. And it is still running to this day. And we're recording this in October of 2015. So it's been a while now. We're on episode, 137, 138, something like that. So it's been a lot and it's been wonderful. And I've been very lucky. We're on 137. And I've been very lucky to have been a part of it.
So is it unfair to say that in essence, ATP was your idea? Because you were asking Marco to start a car show, which ultimately evolved into ATP.
Yeah,
so if you hadn't bugged Marco to start that show, we may never have ATP.
I guess I never thought of it that way. I don't know. I almost feel guilty taking credit for it. And I know you're kind of being tongue in cheek about it, but there is some amount of truth to it, I guess. And it's not to say that Marco wasn't also enthusiastic about Neutral. It's just, he had just finished this long running, because Build and Analyze went for a year and a half, something like that. And he needed a break. And here it is. I'm this idiot friend of his that's, needling him saying, oh, let's do a car show. Let's do a car show. Let's do a car show. And I think he wanted to, it's just, he would have preferred a longer break than I allowed him.
Right.
But that being said, in some way, I guess you could say that ATP is sort of kind of my fault with, humongous air quotes around it. But I think more than anything else, we've just been extremely lucky to have kind of backed our way into something that seems to have some legs to it. And every week I'm thankful to be a part of it.
And current Relay FM listeners, analog listeners, would be jumping at Twitter at me right now if I don't bring up that there has been recent chatter around the halls of Relay FM headquarters on a renewed car show.
Yes. So a couple episodes ago on Analog, which is the show I do with my dear friend Mike Hurley, he had to be. He was in America for XOXO, and so Relay co-founder Stephen Hackett, who you had on this very show just a few episodes ago, he stood in for Mike, and it was actually Stephen's idea to talk about cars for a little while, and so we kind of had an accidental neutral, if you will, during Analog, and I really enjoyed it. I think Stephen really enjoyed it, and the thing of it is that, you know, neutral had very few listeners, but the listeners we had were almost violently loyal. And I mean that in a complimentary way, in a good way. They were hugely loyal, but there were not very many of them. And I don't see any reason why a car show on any other network, including Relay, would be any different. But that being said, I would totally do it for the fun of it, if for no other reason, because I love talking about it. It's so much fun, and I love scratching that itch. And as much as I love, say, football, for example, I don't think I could talk about it for very long on a podcast. I don't know enough about it. I care about it, but not enough to really go on about it. But God, I love and could talk about cars forever. And so let it be known, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever wanted some sucker to come on a car show with you, I'm your guy.
Indeed, and it's. I want to jump back to ATP because I don't want to gloss over that mammoth show right now. I think most people who are a technology podcast fan, who have even the passing interest in tech, has seen ATP. It always lives at or near the top of any technology sorted chart, be it the podcast app, or I'm a Pocket Cast user, or Overcast, and they see it on Twitter. It's everywhere. And I know a lot of people who are going to tune into this show listening right now listen to ATP. What was this ride like, Casey, from this accident into what I don't think I'm overstating, calling it a phenomenon in terms of technology podcasting?
It's been absolutely surreal. I want to start by saying I am exceptionally, indescribably, extraordinarily lucky to be a part of it. I still kind of pinch myself and can't believe that this is my life. When I was going to WWDC, I believe it was 2013. I believe it was the first year that ATP was really getting going. And WWDC, if you're not aware, is the big Apple conference that happens every year in June in San Francisco. And I was going to WWDC, and I was talking to a dear friend of mine who has his own podcast. We refer to him jokingly as Underscore because his Twitter handle starts with an underscore, but his name is David Smith. And I was talking to David Smith in Dulles. We were flying out to San Francisco on the same flight together. And somebody turned around and tapped me on the shoulder. It was somebody behind me. Turned around, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, but are you Casey Liss?" And I must have looked at him like he had 13 heads because I'd never had this happen to me before in my life. And I said, "Yeah, why?" "Oh, well, I recognized your voice and I just want to say hi. I really love the show." Thanks. Wow, that's awesome. Thank you. Like I didn't know what is my life that this is happening right now. Like, why is this a thing? Not that it's a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing, but why is this a thing? Never in a million years did I think I would be in a position where someone came up to me and was like, "Oh, I recognized you from that thing you did." It's still to this day, it's mind numbing, and it doesn't happen terribly often. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and it's not the biggest city in the world by any stretch of the imagination. And day to day, it rarely happens. In fact, my wife just for the first time witnessed me get recognized in public, and it was at an Apple store, which if you're going to choose a place for me to likely be recognized, it would be our local Apple store. But in the 2 years that ATP has been running, almost 3 now, she's never ever seen me get recognized until just a few weeks ago. It's unbelievable being a part of this show. It's unbelievable getting to fraternize with 2 people I respect extremely dearly. And I enjoy so much. You know, I've known Marco, like I said earlier, since we were probably 8 or 10 years old. So I have tremendous respect for Marco, but it's almost a little different with him because, he's just Marco. You know, I've known him forever. Right. And that's kind of unfair of me because Marco has done unbelievably impressive things. But I didn't know John from anyone other than loving Hypercritical. And I met John through Marco at WWDC in 2011. And, we hit it off reasonably well. And, we kept in touch as much as one can, probably via Twitter and an email here and there. And we kept in touch, and we saw each other at WWDC 2012. And then next thing you know, in 2013, we're starting these podcasts together. And it's like, this is John Siracusa. How am I talking to John Siracusa? And I think a lot of other people kind of wonder how Casey's talking to John Siracusa and Marco Arment as well. But it's still so surreal that I get to talk to two of my really close friends and that other people get enjoyment out of it. And I hope I sound appreciative, because I am so deeply appreciative that anyone listens to any of the things I'm on. And it's so wild that that's a thing, and that it's taken off like it has. Like Analog gets enough listeners that I see chatter about it more often than not, every single week. I see a little bit of chatter about it where somebody says, oh, I heard this on Analog, or, oh, that was a great thing on Analog, or, oh, I didn't enjoy that on Analog. But ATP, you hear about it all the time, and,
right.
and it seems to have a lot more reach. And it's hard to realize that that's me, that's a part of it. It's still just completely surreal.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about, and I don't need to tell you, but just from a listener perspective, I'm probably one of the few listeners who would ever get to have one of these conversations with you guys. But, when you've got Marco, who I don't, by any imagination, most people would consider one of the preeminent iOS developers and podcasters in sort of the community today. And then, as you mentioned, John Siracusa, probably, I know he's probably came to most prominence for his writing with the macOS reviews, but also I think I've always felt one of the great Apple orators, between Hypercritical and ATP, the way he can talk about the topics and break them down. And I'm not talking about toaster reviews, but all of them is just insight and intellect and perspective that I don't think anyone else can offer up, and that's with all due respect to everyone else in this field. And to be there sort of, quote unquote, in that virtual room every week has got to, at least at first, felt wildly intimidating. But I can say as a listener, from your perspective, it seems now, in the latter half of 2015 now, you feel like you're kind of a third, right? We've said that a couple times now, but you sort of have a seat at the table. You hold your own as far as I'm concerned. Do you feel the same?
It's very kind of you to say that. It depends on the day. I do feel better about it. I feel like I have found my place for the most part, but there are definitely times that the two of them get on a rant together, and I just kind of sit back and I stop being a host in many ways, and I start just being a listener, because I either don't have anything that I think is necessarily worth contributing, or for the love of everything that's holy, I don't want to stop them on this back and forth banter because I know it's phenomenal. And it's been hard to embrace that there are times when me shutting the hell up is the best possible thing I can do for that show. And it's been something, it's been a chip on my shoulder since the show started, that I kind of backed my way into the situation that you could argue, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, that I don't deserve to be in. I came out of nowhere from most people's estimation, and, there's some truth to that. I came out of nowhere, and next thing you know, I'm on the show with Marco and John. And, what are my credentials? What is my resume that shows that I deserve this? And I would like to think, and I appreciate you saying so, Dan, that 2 years on, I have earned that place. Whether or not I did in the beginning, I've earned it now. But I will forever and always carry a chip on my shoulder about that, and always feel kind of guilty about that. And my only hope is that that's less and less obvious with each new episode.
Well, for what it's worth, here's my 2 cents, and I want to move on to Analog, and this I think will actually be a great segue to that. But here's why I don't think ATP would be ATP without you. And here's why I think that is. When you listen to Build and Analyze and you listen to Hypercritical, those shows that were done with Dan, they were very, very different shows. And while Marco and John were excellent on them, and I listened to those, as did so many other people probably listening to this right now, what they didn't necessarily bring to the table that I think you do every week in ATP is a humanity and a relatability that also then brings that out in John and Marco. And a lot of the topics when you have gone into, when you were detailing, you mentioned, with now being a parent and that whole process and what that was like, or the times you guys have talked about, women in tech and these other topic matters that weren't necessarily because of you, but your perspective and your angle, I think, brings things out in John and Marco that weren't there in their previous shows and cause a more mass relatability in the audience. And I think that's what makes the full-on ATP experience the best that it can be. So that's my take from a listener perspective.
Well, that's extremely nice of you to say, and I really do appreciate it. And I hope that that's the case. I hope that I can kind of ground them. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. It's just they're so unbelievably bright. And I mean, not to say that I'm not, but they're just exceptionally bright. And sometimes I think they can talk about things in a way that maybe not everyone can relate, or they have experiences that not everyone can relate to. And I'm okay with being the everyman or every woman, if you will, or the every person. I'm okay with being the every person. And I hope that if I bring nothing else to the table, if you don't find my comments on tech interesting, if you don't find what I have to say is terribly interesting, I hope that I at least bring us, like you said, Dan, to a position where it's relatable to everyone, not just developers, not just super duper Apple nerds, but just about everyone. And I think both of them, when kept within guardrails, I think both of them are phenomenally good at relating to people, at explaining things. I liked what you said earlier about John being an unbelievable orator. I think that's absolutely true. I've been loving listening to him and Merlin Mann on Reconcilable Differences. That's one of my favorite shows. And I think that Marco is just as good. And Marco is unbelievably good at having these very strong opinions that he does a very, very good job of defending in a way that I deeply admire. And so if I can bring them to a position that we're not getting too out into the weeds, and we're talking about things that everyone can relate to, not just super duper developers. Now, of course, I love the developer talk just as much as anyone else, but I don't think doing a show strictly about developer talk is really what ATP is meant for. I think it's meant to be bigger than that. And so I hope and attempt to bring that level of humanity that maybe, not that they can't, but I think they let themselves run away from a little easier than I do.
Absolutely. And speaking of the humanity and the relatability, that is where and one of the reasons I think, and probably in my own mind, there's some crossover in how I'm relating one to the other, because what's interesting is your second show, and second chronologically, it's also a weekly show, Analog on Relay with Mike Hurley. You bring something, you and Mike are both going after topics and tackling subjects in a completely different way than ATP for the most part. And I think maybe I'm kind of fleshing out the knowledge that I have of Casey. And when I see now the Casey that appears on ATP, it's through sort of the lens of the last year plus of Analog, and maybe it's that concept that makes you feel more the full third to me. But Analog is a completely different kind of show, and a completely different kind of show than really anything out there in sort of the tech or pseudo-tech space. Tell folks a little bit more about Analog. What was the idea for the show? How did it start? And it was because it was one of the premier shows, the startup shows of Relay.
Yeah, so Analog, like you said, with my friend Mike Hurley, who you would know from Connected, from Cortex with CGP Grey, from co-founding Relay, and from this very podcast. He guested quite a few episodes ago now. The idea was that Mike and I would talk. I think the tagline we came up with, which I think might still be on the show art, is "There's space between 0 and 1." The idea there being that, we live in this very binary, very digital world. And certainly if you look at Twitter, it seems that so much of this world, and even American politics, so much of it is you're either right or you're wrong. And there's a lot to be said for what happens with feelings in this space that's supposed to be nothing about logic. It's supposed to be about nothing outside of logic. I mean, it's all logical. It's all yes or no. It's all extreme. What happens to feeling things? And we weren't really sure what we were going to do with it, but we felt like the idea had legs. And we're 60-ish episodes in now, so it certainly seems like there was some amount of legs to it. But the idea originally was let's start from technology and talk about how technology makes you feel. Over time, I think the show has kind of morphed into let's just talk about what it's like to be a person that has feelings, that's alive in today's kind of digitally driven society. And so some common themes you'll hear are feeling like you belong, like a lot of the things I just talked about with ATP. One of the things we talk about a lot is Twitter and how Twitter fits into our lives. I think I speak for Mike in saying we're both kind of addicted to Twitter, yet we both kind of hate Twitter all at the same time. And it's just stuff like that. How does it make my wife and child feel if I'm constantly looking at my telephone, even if we're on vacation? How does Mike figure out a way, or how does Mike balance having this business that's largely founded with and largely populated by Americans? Relay is not exclusively American, but it is overwhelmingly American. And how does he manage that? How does he manage being on an American schedule when he lives in London, in the United Kingdom? It's all these interesting and weird things. And we have decent numbers on Analog. I'm proud of them. I would love for there to be more, but I'm still proud of them. But I would say that in much the same way that not a lot of people listen to Neutral, in fact, far fewer people listen to Neutral, but those who did seem to be extraordinarily loyal. We've been very lucky with Analog in that the fans that we do have do seem to be extraordinarily loyal. And to your point earlier, I think it's a very unique show. And up until Reconcilable Differences, which annoys the crap out of me because it is so darn good, and I feel like it's very similar to Analog. I feel like Reconcilable Differences is the only other kind of like-minded show, because I feel like that's Merlin and John kind of. Theirs is more of exploring their origin stories, but largely through the lens of emotion and feeling, much like Analog is.
Right. And to spin off, you mentioned sort of life in this kind of technological world we find ourselves in now. Folks listening right now, I want to kind of just harken back to a few of my previous episodes. Back on episode 53, I talked with Manoush Zamarodi from Note to Self, a great WNYC show. And that sort of tackles the same thing in terms of, kind of our relationship to technology today. And also Rob McGinley-Myers and Anxious Machines, another show that I've recommended. And so, folks, if you have found and subscribed to either one of those shows and enjoyed them, go over and check out what Casey and Mike are doing with Analog. It's a different take on a similar subject matter, but I have a feeling if you enjoy Note to Self or Anxious Machine, that sort of a conversational, more topical type of show that Analog would be something that you would also find very attractive. So I just point that out. If you ended up subscribing to either of those shows, check out Analog as well. I think you will. I know you will enjoy it. So Analog started with the launch of Relay. Because it was so different, I'm kind of curious was there any idea of sort of leaping off the end of the cliff of this, or maybe this will only go a couple because it's just not working? Or did you guys think that you saw a vacuum here in this type of subject matter? I know you mentioned now Reconcilable Differences kind of doing something similar, but was there some fear in this concept, especially being a launch show for Relay? Yeah, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I believe it was the only show that was not kind of born out of a different show. Yeah, it was the only truly, it was the only truly new show on Relay when Relay launched. And yeah, when Mike and I talked about it, this was not that long after Neutral. Neutral seems like, a bygone memory at this point, but at the time it was only 6 months or a year and a half, something like that, after Neutral. And Neutral was a 12-episode miniseries with one special. And I said to Mike, this will probably run 10, 20 episodes, and I think we'll have talked it out. And when we did it, we did feel like it was both something we wanted to do, but also calculated, because this was a void that we felt we could fill. That being said, we figured it. We didn't know how well it would go and whether or not it had legs. And I think the turning point in Neutral for me was somewhere between episode 20 and 30, when I really gave up on the format that we had founded upon, which was, let's start from a technology and talk about how we feel. And I really embraced just having a conversation about how we feel about just about anything. And it took until 20 or 25 or 30 or something like that for me to really embrace that.
But I think the show got a lot better after that because I stopped trying to shoehorn it into what I thought it should be and started accepting what it had become.
Did you think, and I'm going to ask you a little bit of a selfish question here, and if I'm completely wrong, please let me know, but Mike Hurley has a long resume, especially in the previous incarnation with early on and with Inquisitive. It took me a second. I talked with him about Behind the App and Inquisitive, and the name was escaping me, but of an interview-based show. And so a lot of wonderful people have sat on the other side of the table, so to speak, from him. And now when you look at the other stable of relay shows, he's got, you mentioned CGP Grey and Jason Snell and Federico and on and on and on and on. When you were moving from ATP, especially the way you were feeling about ATP, say, a year ago, maybe not quite as comfortable as you are today, as we already talked about, did you feel like this was the idea of something that may have been a little bit more your own, a little bit more an introduction to an audience that was a little more 50-50 as opposed, where it was of your own creation, where, am I making sense that was there that concept there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an also ran. I'm half of the show, and yeah, I think that was some of it. I was and remain proud of Analog because, in part, it is a 50-50 endeavor between Mike and I, and I think it was very cathartic for both of us because I think Mike has talked about, although I can't place where off the top of my head, he has talked in the past about, maybe it was even on Analog, that he has felt a little bit like an also ran on Connected between Federico Viticci and Stephen Hackett. And he feels in some ways like I do on Connected, in that we're kind of, not always, but sometimes kind of the referee, just making sure things are moving forward. And I think it was helpful for both of us to do something that was just us. And it's for the listeners, of course, but also for us. And I think that's part of the reason why we stuck with it at first, was because we were really proud of discussing things that, quite honestly, I don't think a lot of people are comfortable discussing. And I think episode 6 of Analog is a great example of that. That's when we had Stephen Hackett as a guest, and Mike talked about, some departures in his family, both deliberate ones and a relative that had passed away. Stephen Hackett talked about his eldest child who has pediatric cancer. I talked about the fertility issues that Aaron and I had in bringing our son into the world. And that was something that I don't think a lot of people are or were especially willing to talk about. And I was and remain proud of Analog for talking about those things amongst many, many, many others. And I think one of the things that makes Analog so special is that the list of things that Mike and I are unwilling to talk about is extremely short. And that's for a reason. It's because it's kind of our not our happy place. It's our safe place. And we promised each other going into it that we were going to push this as far as we could, but not too far. And hopefully we've achieved that and are achieving that. And so in bringing this into the world, I think it was important to both of us to do something that we were very proud of and we could look at and say, you know what, I'm not so sure everyone could do that. And not to say that everyone can do ATP or neutral or what have you, but I think talking about technology is a much less risky thing to do than talking about how you feel, because how you feel is a very innately personal thing, and it's something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I'm very proud that we do that every single week.
Absolutely. And that episode you referenced, episode 6 of Analog, I couldn't remember the number, but that one definitely stands out in my mind, if for nothing else, that I still receive weekly St. Jude emails because of the contribution I made to St. Jude when I heard that episode in Stephen's story at that time. And it was important, that episode. And I don't know of any other better descriptive word other than it was important podcasting, that people who are in Stephen's position or people who are in you and your wife's position, I think too often folks may not hear that enough to understand that there are others out there just like them that are going through something similar. And what you guys provide, I see as almost a public service in that type of episode. And at least for somebody like me as a listener, it got me up and moving to take action, at least, for Stephen's case, for sure.
Yeah, and that's very awesome that you did that. And I have been donating to St. Jude every year, or I should say my wife and I have been donating to St. Jude every year ever since we really became friendly with Stephen, and it's for that very same reason. And we had gotten, and still occasionally do get, so much unbelievably wonderful feedback from that episode from people who say, oh my God, I'm so happy to hear somebody else talking about this, because I thought I was the only one, or I have friends who I think might have problems like these, but we never talk about it. And so just like you said, Dan, it's been unbelievably rewarding to hear people say to you, thank you so much for talking about that thing that I didn't know anyone had the guts to talk about. And I hope that we continue to do that on Analog and also ATP. I'm extraordinarily proud of all of the episodes of ATP, but particularly the ones where we conquer things that are really, really difficult. I really liked the conversation we had just an episode or two ago with regard to Marco pulling his content blocker piece, which caused a big kerfuffle in our little world. I'm exceptionally proud of the couple of episodes we've talked about women in tech, which you made reference to earlier. Those were not easy episodes. We did not get a lot of we got a lot of great feedback from them, and we got a lot of nasty feedback from them. I'm very proud of the crossover we did between Rocket and us, where we had Christina Warren on our show instead of John, and John went to their show. They're small gestures, all of these. The Analog gesture is small. The episodes of ATP are small gestures. But if we can change the opinion of even just a couple of people, which I feel pretty confident in saying we have, then damn it, that's a pretty big success, and I'm really proud of that.
And it's so much better than hearing some crap Twitter comment or email about your opinion on the iPhone, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels so much more important, like you're actually having impact, and that's so much, it's got to feel like this is worth it. The time you spend by yourself in the room with the microphone in your face has such a realistic and meaningful impact.
That's exactly right. Or at least that's the hope anyway.
So staying on the relay topic, zooming out a little bit, not just for Analog, what's it like? I asked Stephen this as well because I actually talked to him. Ironically enough, my show and Stephen hit with Relay, Stephen and Mike with Relay hit the year right around the same mark. So my 1 year episode featured Stephen, and I wanted to get his opinion on the first year. But since you've been around as a launch show on Relay, what's it been like being part of the Relay family for its first year?
It's been awesome. It's been pretty wild. When we started, I think it was 6 shows or 7 shows, something like that. And now it's quite a bit more than that. It's been extremely, extremely cool to watch a couple of really close friends of yours be successful and watch it from the front lines. Mike and Stephen and I, obviously Mike and Stephen are exceptionally close. And I would say that Mike and I and Stephen and I are very close, but it's been unbelievably rewarding and just awesome to watch them be as successful as they've been. And you heard me say just a minute ago that we have done well. And I say that, and I always feel guilty when I say that because I don't think about it and it just comes out. But I don't have anything to do with the running of Relay. That's all Mike and Stephen. But because Relay is such a family, as cheesy and cliche as that may sound, it is such a family that when they do well and when Relay does well, I feel like I'm doing well too. When Reconcilable Differences launched and did really well, I feel like that's a win for me too. When Top 4 launched and did really well, I feel like that's a win for me too. When Cortex launched and that's been doing exceptionally well, that's a win for me too. And it's just, imagine taking a group of friends that you genuinely really, really, really love and trying to make a business from it and then having it kind of really work out okay. That's what it's been like. And it's been awesome. And just like with ATP, I'm so lucky to be a part of it.
And it has been amazing in terms of seeing the names that have joined the family. One we haven't mentioned, and I listened to it almost solely because I'm a huge fan of Andy Ihnatko. And while I'm not an Android user, I am also an Apple user. I listen to Material because I absolutely love Andy Ihnatko. And so Andy's in there. And as you mentioned, Merlin and John and then Marco and Tiff, which the husband and wife thing is so great. I think you may need to have a conversation with Aaron. Maybe you guys could do top 5.
Yeah, who knows?
But so many of these names, as you mentioned, have joined the family. And I don't know, Mac Power users, right? I don't know if anything speaks more highly about what Mike and Steven have done and accomplished than all of these folks are willing to sort of plant some roots in the Relay family. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, and it really is a testament to you can run a successful business without being a jerk. You know, Mike and Steven are great, great, great guys, and they treat us really, really, really well. And they're unbelievably easy to work with. And turns out, if you're a great person who treats your people well, that's easy to work with, people are going to want to work with you. I know that sounds weird, but that's the case. And so it's a testament to the two of them, particularly that all of these unbelievably large names have shown up. And I think it's also testament to Jason Snell, who I think was in many ways the first like really big star to join the network. It's a testament to him to taking a chance on all of us, but particularly Steven and Mike. And I like to think, and I think he would say, that it's worked out pretty darn well for him. And when Jason arrived, it gave Relay a credibility that I'm not sure many other people could have provided for it. And so that was a pivotal moment in Relay's history. And one that I remember talking to Mike and Steven about, and they said, oh my God, I think Jason's going to do a show with us. Oh my God, I think it's going to happen. And, you know, Jason has his own network. He has the Incomparable. And you could argue that he didn't have anything to gain from joining Relay. I think that'd be wrong, but you could make that argument. Mm-hmm. And for him to join Relay really, I think, gave it the boost it needed to really turn into something amazing.
Yeah, and you know, what's funny is Jason Snell was probably similar again to what you mentioned with Relay. I've reached out to a lot of people to join me, and so often I would think there's no chance. And Jason Snell agreed, and very much like you're describing, I felt like that really sort of was a turning point as well. For going back, I did talk with Mike prior to Jason, which was excellent as well, but as we said, Jason Snell has such a rich history as a writer about Apple and all things technology, from podcasting to his time at Macworld, so on and so forth. And what was amazing was how unlike his resume he was. Just the most personable, down-to-earth, approachable gentleman that anyone would ever want to meet. And I was a huge fan prior, and now being fortunate enough to have the opportunity to have that. I told him an hour. I think it was still to this day one of my longest shows. I think it went like an hour 22 minutes because I had to physically stop myself because we could have gone on forever, and that was just such a joy. And it's great that he's taken up now 2 shows at Relay. 3, I'm sorry, 3, right? Clockwise, Liftoff, and Upgrade. Him, Mike, and Renee Ritchie all need to just physically tally all there, although Renee told me on Twitter a few weeks back that he's kind of cutting back. But so maybe it's just a Jason and Mike competition between appearances on podcasts at this point. Yeah,
and just to double down on what you said, when I went to WWDC for the first time in 2011, the only person I really knew was Marco, and Marco was kind enough to kind of take me along and introduce me to a bunch of people that I had no business talking to because I was some schmuck from Virginia that nobody knew. And of the people I met that were stars in their own right, at least in our little Apple bubble, Jason Snell and Jim Dalrymple were probably the 2 people that were far, and actually Craig Hockenberry too. I would be remiss not to mention Craig. The 3 of them were some of the nicest people in the world to me, and they had nothing to gain from being nice to me. I'm a nobody. I'm just Marco's weird friend that apparently he's known for forever. And the 3 of them were unbelievably kind to me when they really didn't need to be. And I will forever remember and appreciate them for being that way, because they didn't have to be.
So a little bit on the not so kind front, Casey, because I know you've talked about it a little bit on Analog, and I'm curious how, and I know you've touched on this, so I don't want to rehash necessarily things that you've already had out there, because folks, I want you guys to go back and listen to a lot of these topics. But I'm just curious to ask you directly, from that nobody that you're referring to yourself as once, way back when, to today, putting out these, anywhere from 3 to 4 hours in audio every week in a show like Analog, that can be very personally divulgent, being feelings one of its major topics. How have you dealt with this massive audience and the feedback that I know too often can walk a vile or negative line? Have you gotten to a place now, I know you've had your struggles with it in the past, but are you at a place now where some of this sort of rolls off the back, or is it still something that is kind of a necessary evil of this life you've kind of created for yourself?
Yeah, it depends on when you ask me, I guess. I like to think that I'm getting a lot better about it, and it's something I struggle with constantly. At the end of August, I wrote a post on my website entitled Yin and Yang, and in there I discuss some of the feedback that we had received from ATP. And I did that in part because I don't think people realize how vile and nasty and hateful people can be when they're protected by anonymity. And if I weren't receiving these emails myself, I never would have believed that somebody would be so troubled to send something like this. And so there were a couple of emails that came in very, very quickly to the ATP feedback that I thought were just wholly and unbelievably inappropriate. And I'll read one of them very quickly, or maybe I'll read one and a couple excerpts from the other. They're very short. The first one, listening to Marco and Casey droll on and on about their crappy, let's say, defective kids is the worst thing to happen to you on a long commute where you can't play with your phone to change the track. Worst 30 minutes of my life. Nobody cares about your stupid kids. Not even thanks to the fact that Casey has defective reproductive issues and had to bother all of us for years with his sob stories about getting pregnant. No one cares. And you know what? I'll just leave it at that. That's enough. But it's how do you see that and not get upset about it? How do you see that and not get frustrated? And I got exceptionally upset and frustrated about that. I like to think I've learned from it, and I like to think I'm getting better about realizing that this email isn't really about me. It's about the person that wrote it, and it's about them not really being comfortable with whatever they're going through in their own lives. But it hurt. It hurt a lot. And it's something I constantly struggle with. And the other email was basically about how I'm an idiot and I don't deserve to be an ATP and blah, 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 which I still see from time to time. And I really genuinely believe I'm getting better and better and better and better about it, about dealing with these things. But even when you have many, many, many layers of armor on, there's always that one weakness, and there's always that one slight little crack in the seams that always happens to be directly above your heart. And every once in a while, something cuts through, like that email did. And it just really, really hurts. And it's just something that you have. It's the price of being as lucky as I am to do something I love and be compensated for doing it. And if I really remove myself from this as much as I can and look at the bigger picture, if getting a hateful email a couple of times a month, maybe even a couple of times a week on a bad week, if that's the only price I have to pay to do something I love and get compensated for it, I'm coming out on top. I tell you what, man, it's hard to remember that in the heat of the moment. It is hard.
What, in a couple of sentences, a lot of podcasters listen to this show, Casey. If in a couple of sentences, what advice would you give to other podcasters out there who may have just started to receive their first ever feedback like this, or may in a couple of months, how they can not throw their phone across the room, or worse, shoot off something just as vile back? What would you tell those guys?
Yeah, that's the approach I took for a long time. And what I've taught myself by making the same mistake many, many, many times is that responding to and otherwise acknowledging these emails, to be honest, very much like I just did, doesn't usually help anyone. I like to think I just use this email as an illustrative example, but really the perfect scenario is it's never brought up. It's deleted, it's burned with fire, and you never think of it again. And responding to it doesn't help anything. And what I've tried to do is pay attention to how I feel when I fire off one of those screw you emails in reply to something hateful like this. And what I've found is when I really sit back and I'm honest with myself, initially after I send that screw you right back, buddy email, I feel great. God, do I feel good? Because you know what? Screw that person. They deserve it. But about 5 to 10 minutes later, maybe an hour, if I am really proud of the email that I wrote, maybe an hour later, I don't feel so good anymore. And I feel kind of ashamed and embarrassed that I acknowledged it and that I replied to it. And it's taken a long time. It's taken me 2 years to realize that. And one of the things that I haven't done, but I almost wonder if I should, is start keeping a file of really complimentary things that people have said to me. I mean, I haven't deleted really just about any feedback we've gotten from ATP. I'm not even sure I deleted that email, but I almost wonder if it would be helpful for me to keep around some of the really complimentary emails that I've gotten. And there have been several. I mean, I wouldn't say there's been an avalanche of them, but there have been plenty of extremely complimentary emails, especially after I wrote this post. I wasn't trying to grovel for compliments or to fish for compliments, but I think that's how some people read it, which is fine. And I'm extremely thankful for them for taking the time out of their day to send something nice to me. And having a file of like, here's some examples of why you count, why you deserve to be there, why you're important, and why people like you. You know, I need like a Stuart Smalley file to refer back to every once in a while to convince myself, gosh darn it, people like you.
Let's talk about the website a little bit. CaseyLiss.com. Liss is more, appropriately titled. And link will be in the show notes, of course. I've heard you talk about this on a couple of different times, that you've wanted to write more, that you've wanted to sort of explore different things. And today, as we record, you just posted a new one, which was really interesting. I'd never read anything like this, and I don't necessarily have the need at this time, but I will come back to it if I ever need to travel internationally on global entry, which I thought was really interesting. Sort of, where does Liss is More fit in the ATP analog full-time job life? What are sort of some of your ideas? What would you like to do with it?
So Liss is more than anything else me, because I'm not sharing it with anyone. The only guest post that's ever been on Liss is More was I had Erin, my wife, write her own review of the Apple Watch that I posted the same time I posted my review. And we might do that again in the future, something along those lines. But generally speaking, of the, I don't know, how many posts do I have on here? I have 180 articles, thereabout. Of 180 articles, 179 of them are me. And so Liss is More, my website is more than anything else a true representation of just me. And that involves all sorts of random and sundry things. It involves a extremely long dissertation about global entry, which is this program that you can apply to in the United States if you're an American to let you get through customs and passport control much quicker. The post before that was just something interesting I noticed about, or that actually Federico called to my attention about reminders in the new version of iOS. And the post before that was a story about when I drove a Ferrari as a 16-year-old. And I think that that's a perfect encapsulation of what this website is intended to and is intended to be and ends up being, which is, this is what I care about. And sometimes that's a story from when I was 16 that I just thought was kind of cool and interesting. Sometimes it's something interesting in iOS that I just noticed. And sometimes it's something about how you can travel a little bit easier if you're willing to give up a couple of things, including $100. And because of that, I am in some ways more proud of my website than I am of anything else. And I should also note that the entire website from start to finish is me, including the software that serves the website to you as a reader. I wrote that from scratch. And so in so many ways, from top to bottom, this is me in a way that ATP and Analog could never be, because by definition, I share that with one or two other people. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, that makes those shows better, and much like the ways you were talking about earlier, Dan. But nevertheless, it's never going to be a pure representation of me like my website will be. And I hope, I put an ad on there from Carbon Ads in the last few months, and it brings in enough money to fund the website and, an okay dinner for my wife and I each month. I hope that over time, maybe I can monetize my website, not in the sleazy, gross way. I already feel disgusting having said it that way. But, I can earn some money from my website that would maybe make a noticeable dent on my family's income. That would be amazing. I don't expect to be Daring Fireball tomorrow or even next year or the year after. But imagine in 5 years if I was, in that tier of Daring Fireball and 6 colors and max stories and 512 pixels. That would be amazing. So we'll see.
And that was sort of what I was getting at. It was something I had the conversation with Steven about. I asked him similarly about 512 pixels, because be it 512 or be it your site, or I guess maybe even Marco's, these are interesting. I don't know if side project is the right word. I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but it's that theory, right? Not necessarily the main drag of what you guys are doing, but it is there. It is important, and it is things that you guys put a lot of time and effort into. And I'm always curious when I look at, John Gruber and Jim Dalrymple, or even Jason with 6 colors, do you guys want to someday evolve to that point, whether it's an urgent need or want or not? Is that sort of the end game?
Yeah, I don't know if I would be a good writer if I didn't have the life experience of doing other things, like where John Gruber, I think, can be an excellent writer as his full-time job and profession. I don't know that I would be able to do that, because I think I would need the inspiration from other things. But if I could make writing a half-time endeavor,
right,
insofar as it earns a commensurate amount of money such that I can justify spending half of a work week on it, by God, I would love that. I really enjoy doing it, and I'll leave it to the listeners and readers, I guess, whether or not I'm any good at it, but I enjoy it. And things that you enjoy, you tend to spend the time at to hopefully eventually get good at. And I think I've written some duds, and I think I've written some great stuff, and hopefully over time, there'll be less and less duds, and there'll be more and more great posts, and only time will tell.
Well, I think a lot of people can sympathize from that, whether you're a writer or a podcaster.
Sure.
Yeah, we all want a lot less duds. Well, Casey, I mentioned to you beforehand, I could not have you on the line with me, just like I did with Jason and Steven, and not at least get a couple quick takes on some current Apple topics. Not that you don't, put them out there all the time, but I thought of ones that I have heard you either recently waver on or maybe just want to kind of flesh out a little bit. But iPad Pro. Are you getting one? What's your general thoughts on it?
No. I mean, I'm super anxious to see one in stores. I'm anxious to play with the keyboard, even though I've made so much fun of Surface users for the exact same keyboard. I'm anxious to play with the Apple Pencil. I'm anxious to try it, but I cannot fathom carrying around a 12-inch iPad. To be fair, the last time I've said things like that was about, buying a Mac and then buying an iPhone and then buying the original iPad and buying a BMW, which I eventually did buy one used. I can't fathom wanting an iPad Pro, but anytime I say that, fast forward a year or two and I've totally reneged on it. So I'll come back to this on your second anniversary and we'll see if I've held strong.
And, I think this is one of the reasons why so many people like you. It's one of the reasons I do the exact same thing. You did this with the watch, and I was
that's another great example.
Yeah, every week, and I did the same thing, and I had to come up with a game plan when I got the Apple Watch. I had to take my wife with me, and here in southeastern Pennsylvania, our nearest Apple store is in the King of Prussia Mall, which is just a huge mall. Right next to the Apple store in the King of Prussia Mall is a Williams-Sonoma. So my wife went into Williams-Sonoma. I went into Apple Store, and we both spent way too much money, but it was the only way I was going to get it back in the house. After telling her, oh, no, the Pebble's fine, honey. I don't need anything other than the Pebble.
Absolutely.
So I can appreciate it. Speaking of recent purchases, I do know from listening, you do have the 6S. Not the Plus, right? You're 6S.
That is correct. Mike was wrong about the Plus. I am not a member of the Plus Club, but I do have a 6S.
So 3D Touch, like it, or is it a gimmick? What do you think?
Totally love it. Yeah. Just earlier today, I tried to 3D Touch on my iPad. Got very sad that that didn't work. It may end up that it will turn out a gimmick, but sitting here now, I don't think so, and I'm pretty in love with it. And I'm pretty sure Tapbots has said publicly that the next version of Tweetbot will support 3D Touch, and let's just say I'm pretty confident it's going to be pretty great.
Yeah, and then you'll never leave Tweetbot.
Yeah, seriously, that's the last thing I need, but it's true.
Oh, Tweetbot on the iPad now is, somebody said it, and they said exactly right. It's the first time in a long time I preferred to read Twitter on an iPad because it's awesome. I love it.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be on the beta cycle for Tapbots, and when I finally got Tweetbot on the iPad, it was like a breath of fresh air. You know, a lot of people really love Twitterific. John, Jason, both really love Twitterific. I loved Craig Hockenberry, who I brought up earlier, that it was one of the main authors of Twitterific. I just don't find that Twitterific works the way my brain works. It's not that it's bad. It's just not the way my brain works. And Tweetbot does work the way my brain works. And so I'd been using Twitterific on my iPad for something like a year. And it's not that I hated it, but it wasn't my favorite thing in the world. And when I finally got that updated version of Tweetbot, it was like the heavens, shone down on me, and you heard the angels singing in the background, and it was just, this is finally happening, and it was amazing. And so I'm so happy that they were finally able to release and do so, and they've been at the top of or certainly prominent on the App Store for the last week or so since it's come out, and they deserve every bit of it. It's a wonderful app.
I never questioned. I had no idea what the launch price would be. Didn't care. I was buying it no matter what. And just today updated the Mac version as well. So now all is right in the world again. So
yeah, when the Mac version came out, I was pretty grumbly about the fact that it was $20. I don't know if it still is or not, but I was kind of upset about it. But then I thought about it, and whether or not I should, I do spend an just inordinate amount of time in all three of the Tweetbot apps for the iPhone, for the iPad, and for the Mac. And darn it, if anyone deserves $20 of my money for that, and then $5 for the iPad and iPhone, it's certainly Tapbots, because I just spend so much time in those apps and I love them to death.
Yeah, I think with the recent version, they settled on 13, and I think actually as we speak, it's down on a launch sale of 10, I believe.
Oh, God, right get that right now. Yeah. If you're a Mac user, buy it right now. Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
It is awesome. It is awesome. That's for sure. One more Apple on this one. Apple TV, day one purchase, because I think it is for me.
Not sitting here now. If Plex whenever Plex is ready for the new Apple TV, that will strongly change my tune. Plex is an app that lets you manage media that you've ripped, or depending on your opinion about these sorts of things, that you've acquired.
There you go.
But one way or another, I've ripped a bunch of our Blu-rays and a bunch of our DVDs, and I adore Plex. It is one of my favorite apps up there with Tweetbot. And they have announced that they will bring a Plex app to the Apple TV, but they haven't said when. And to be fair, I would not expect it to be a launch app. In fact, it would almost be bad if it's a launch app, because maybe they haven't spent the time with it that they should. Right. Whenever Plex happens for the Apple TV, that will probably force my hand, and I will probably buy one. Until that time, I have been using an Amazon Fire TV stick on the recommendation of Dan Morin, and I adore it. There's a lot not to like about it, but the few apps that I use on it, Plex, Netflix, I'm sure there's one or two others I'm forgetting, but Plex especially is really good on it. And to be able to take this little teeny tiny device and a little teeny tiny remote and take that with you even when you travel, and then have, Slingbox is the other one I was thinking of, have these three apps that basically give you any media you'd ever want to see anywhere in the world that has an internet connection, including a hotel room. That's pretty magical. And so I bring this little Fire TV stick and a remote, and I can get to our home television via the Slingbox, our DVR, and any of the media that I guess the long-term media, if you will, that we have stored on Plex and also Netflix. And so for $35 or whatever it is, it was unbelievably worth it. And that's one of my favorites.
So nothing about the gaming does much for you.
Oh, no. I used to be hugely into Nintendo games, huge, way back in the day. And then around the time after the Nintendo 64, I kind of never looked back. We did have a Wii, which we played periodically, but outside of a fair bit of Rock Band, especially upon having an adult beverage or two, we never really got that much use out of the Wii. Yeah. Are you excited for the Apple TV? Is that something you're into?
I think so, because I'm sort of like you, right? I've got streamers everywhere. Believe it or not, in my house right now, I've got a Chromecast, a Roku, and a Fire TV stick. And an Apple TV. I'm not even joking. The Roku's in the bedroom. I had the Fire TV stick I just removed for the Chromecast. And the only reason I did is I'm 2 floors away from the router, and for some reason, I think I've got connection issues, whereas the Chromecast didn't. I don't know why. But the Apple TV has been our living room box. So if we want Netflix, bring the kids around, and everybody watch a movie, it's on Apple TV. And I want to get the new one, if for nothing else, to get the old one out because it is horrible at this point and slow and janky, and I swear I'm logging into everything every time there's a power outage, and it's just problematic to say the least. So that, and I don't have the 6S Plus. I would be a Plus guy. I can't see me doing the iPad Pro. So my theory and I already got the watch this summer. So my theory to the wife is, hey, this fall, it's only going to be $150, $200. That's it. She's like, I can live with that. So
fair enough. And you didn't ask me about, but I would be remiss not to mention the live photos.
Yes.
They're the real deal.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, they are the real deal. Now, it's all about perspective here, though. A lot of people think of it as like, oh, these are really crappy videos. No, you're missing the point. The point is, it's a photograph that has context that you would not have gotten otherwise. And I've been really obsessed lately with every picture that we take, particularly of our son, of adding the metadata of like where it was taken, for example, so I can always figure that out. And of course, any picture you're going to take these days will automatically have a timestamp on it. With live photos, what you get is you get like a second and a half of video before and after the actual still photo was taken. Admittedly, this video is much lower quality. It's got a crappy frame rate, but seeing our baby, say, sitting in his car seat, and just seeing that still is pretty cool. But seeing him like hold out his finger to touch mine or to look around just adds that context, adds that magic to it that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And you've probably heard me say 83 times on this episode, if I recall correctly, or if memory serves, or things like that. I don't have a terribly great memory. And so seeing the context of what was happening around the time a picture was taken is going to be amazing. And even just looking back on pictures I took the day we got the phones, that has been awesome. And the problem that I have is that we spent a reasonable amount of money on a Micro Four Thirds camera that we got right before our baby was born, specifically to take better photos of him. And those photos are still better. We've got some really nice glass on that camera, and it's a higher megapixel, just better camera in general. However, every time I go to take a picture of him, I'm now having like this anxiety attack over, should I use the big camera or should I use the iPhone and get that context that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise? So I will defend live photos to the death. 3D touch, I could see going either way, although I am in favor of it, and I do think it's the real deal. But live photos, absolutely the real deal. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
So the two things I think about live photos, again, I don't have the 6S, but these are my two thoughts. The first being that, yes, except unless you have a 16 gig phone.
True.
Don't buy that anyways, as everyone says. I have the 6 Plus and I have 128, so I really couldn't deal with a 16. And then the other thing I think is, I believe, was it 9.0.1 or 2 where I heard that they got rid of the problem of phone dropping after the picture with live photo, that they started to cut that off where every live photo just wouldn't end with a picture of the ground.
Right. So to kind of fill in the gaps here, basically when you take a live photo, all you're doing is snapping a picture, but what the phone has already been doing is recording video and buffering it up until the time you hit go, and it will then continue to take video for about a second and a half after you've pressed the shutter button. Well, what was happening was nobody's used to having to worry about this. And most people, they'll take the picture, drop their phone to the, well, not on the ground, but, lower their phone so they can talk to whoever it is they're taking a picture of. Well, what ended up happening was all these live photos had a second and a half of great, context, and then a second and a half of you putting your phone away. Well, I think it's in iOS 9.1. I think it's in the beta. Apple solved this problem in a really fascinating way. They realized or decided or whatever that, we have an accelerometer on this phone. So what we'll do is we'll keep a buffer of 3 seconds before you take the before you take the photo. And if you leave the phone approximately still, we'll do exactly what we've always been doing, which is we'll do a second and a half of video, photograph, second and a half of video. But if we notice via the accelerometer that the moment or shortly thereafter, when you take this photo, you start putting the phone away, we'll take more of the time before the photo was snapped. So maybe you have 2 seconds photo, 1 second, maybe you have 3 seconds photo and nothing afterwards. And that to me is such a brilliant piece of problem solving and engineering. And that's what really revs my engine is what a great and reasonably simple solution to a very, very odd and interesting problem.
Yeah, that is awesome. So 9.1, if that's where it is. I've only got the beta on the iPad, but yeah, that is genius. And I think that really changes the game, because I think if all of them ended up with a floor shot, people would instantly turn it off. But if it's not, and they are ensuring that the value you're describing is coming out of every time they do this, I think you're right. It will be gangbusters. And I think the other thing is ubiquity, right? If this thing starts taking off where other manufacturers start adopting something similar, maybe there's even a new file format that kind of generally keeps them together and not separate files. Or, if Twitter or Facebook start allowing live photos as profile photos, if it kind of starts to go everywhere, then I think it'll be a big deal for sure.
Yep, completely agree.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to be any more gobbling up your time here, Casey. I really can't thank you enough for taking the time to join me this evening. Before we go, though, take just a minute, remind everybody where to find all the stuff you're doing online.
Sure. So Neutral is still online. We'll start from the beginning, and that is at neutral.fm. The Accidental Tech Podcast with my dear friends Marco Arment and John Siracusa is at atp.fm. And Analog is at relay.fm/analog, spelled either the British way, like Mike would be proud of, or the correct way, like I would be proud of. And finally, you can find my website at caseylist.com, and you can find me at Twitter at CaseyLiss.
And folks, each and every one of those links will be in the show notes as per normal. Casey Liss, thank you again for taking the time for joining me.
Dan, thank you so very much. I really do appreciate it. And what Dan didn't mention really was that I was a complete diva about scheduling this, and it took us forever to put this together. And that's all my fault, but I really do appreciate your patience, and thank you so much for having me on. It's been a blast.
It was a thrill to talk to you, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed. Come back again next week for another great interview. And if you like what you heard tonight, a review, a recommendation, tell a friend. This is a place I want them to come to find out about any new shows to add to their subscription list. Until next week, folks, my name is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/the Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.